Hi, welcome to the Glass Pavilion at the Toledo Museum of Art. This is our 4 p.m. demonstration and the last demonstration of the Great Art Escape for 2021. So I'm going to quickly introduce you to our gaffer today. Our gaffer is going to be Sandy for this demonstration. His assistant will be Jake. I am Kelly and I will be your narrator. So quickly before we get started, if this is your first time watching Glassblowing, we're going to go over a little bit about our equipment that we're going to be using during this demonstration. If it's not your first time, this will be a little bit of a refresher. So we're going to start over there at our furnace. Our furnace is full of molten glass. It sits at around 2,150 degrees. And you can see that heat just by the light that's emitting out of the front of it. And right next to it is going to be our pipe warmer. You can see some things jutting out of those. Those are going to be our pipes that will be used today. So our pipe warmer just keeps everything nice and warm. So it keeps everything to about 900 degrees, just those front ends of the pipes, because hot glass only likes to stick to hot things. So if a cool pipe were to go into the furnace, the glass will not want to adhere to it. So we have to make sure they're nice and warm. And then right over here, you can see another glowing circle there. That is our reheating chamber. That is at the same temperature as our furnace. And it's just where we're going to be putting the glass as we're working on it into the reheating chamber, getting it up to a nice workable temperature. And without further ado, Sandy and Jake are going to begin to reconstruct Humpty Dumpty. Take it away. So what Sandy just picked up is one of our blowpipes. It's a larger one than we usually use, but we are doing larger sculpture work today. And he's going to begin by taking a gather of glass out of that furnace. So all of the glass inside of this furnace is completely clear. You can still see that orange glow, and that's just the heat light. So there's no color actually in this glass. And later on in the process, we're actually going to be adding color to it. And when he goes in to gather that glass, it is the viscosity of honey. So he just dips his pipe in and turns a couple of times, and he just rolls that glass on up onto that rod. So we let it cool down a little bit, enough to get a skin on the outside. So as glass cools, and it cools very quickly out in the open air, it gets a skin of cold glass. So it's just an area that's a little bit more solid. It allows you to gather more glass over top of it. If he would have gone in to gather right after he got his first gather, he could have even come out with less glass than he had before. Because glass really likes to kind of stick in on itself, and it likes to be a big blob inside of that furnace. And he's going to shape that up using a wooden block. So that block has been soaked in water. It's made out of cherry wood, just because it has a very tight grain. And this just allows us to shape the glass into a nice Q-tip shape. A Q-tip shape is pretty much the first shape you make when you're starting to blow glass. It allows, when you introduce the bubble, it allows it to form nice and evenly. And also it'll give you a little bit of a thicker skin onto the bottom of the glass, so you can make sure there's a little bit more weight there. It's just kind of a basic starting shape. Just going to cool through the end of that pipe. And now we have a hollow form on the inside. But now since we've introduced that hollow form, the rules of glass have changed a little bit. Now we're worried about the thickness of the walls. So before it was this solid mass that was really hot still on the inside and could cool down rather quickly on the outside. But now that the inside is hollow, the walls, if they're really thin, they will cool down really fast. And if they're thicker, the outside will cool down and the inside will still be warm. During the entire time of glass blowing, you're really focused on the heat of your vessel, of your work. Because if it gets too cold, it could crack. And if it's too hot, you could lose all definition and you can lose control of the glass because it's reverting back into its liquid form. So he's letting it cool down again so we can gather over top so we can get even more glass to make this Humpty Dumpty. And it's especially important to make sure that your glass is cooled down and solidified when you're going to gather over top of a bubble, because once again, if it's too hot, you could lose control and you could actually collapse that entire bubble down on itself. He's going to cool off his pipe. That's a heavier pipe, and he wants to make sure he can grab closer to the glass to keep the weight right into his center so it's a lot easier to handle. The glass feels a lot heavier if you're at the other end of the pipe than the glass. You see Jake assisting. He's taking some of the pressure off of Sandy. So usually glass blowing is a stand up, sit down kind of thing. But when you're making something rather large, it helps to have an assistant be able to take your piece to the reheating chamber and bring it back to you, because during those few seconds you can think about what you're doing next, and you can also prepare all your tools that you need. It also helps that you're not quite as tired from carrying all that heavy glass around. And I'm going to attach a blow hose so that Sandy can blow his own piece. Usually it would be Jake blowing at the very end of the blowpipe, but because of the times that we're in right now, we're each individually blowing for ourselves. And using that newspaper, he can actually touch and manipulate the glass, so as he's inflating, he can squeeze it down and shape it. A newspaper is literally just what it's called. It's about 7 layers of newspaper folded together and then submerged in water. And the water is what really lets us get our hands that close to the glass, because there's this thing called the Leidenfrost effect. So instead of it just burning through the newspaper and going directly to our hand at that 2000 degree temperature, it's actually just the steam creating a bed. So it looks like here in just a second they're going to get ready to do some color application. And usually if you've seen a demonstration at the museum before, we use what's called bar stock, but today we're going to be using powder, and I'll show you the different forms of color here in a second. So we're still inflating that, getting it right to the shape. So they're at a downdraft table, so any excess powder is going to just get sucked down. They're not going to breathe it in. But you can see Jake is kind of shaking a strainer over top, tapping it, and letting that powder just rain through it. It's kind of the texture and consistency of confectioner sugar. So just like you would put powdered sugar onto your French toast, you can do the same thing with glass here. You're just going to melt that in, and usually with powders we're going to do a couple of layers just to get a nice opacity with this color, and this is a nice white for the shell of this egg. And it's really nice they're using white. It's one of the few colors you can actually see the entire time you're working with glass. Most colors don't show up. You don't see them as their correct color until it cools down. But when you have a white, it actually stays white pretty much for the entire time. Unless you get it super hot, then it turns a little bit clear. Also, if you've ever done a workshop with us, you can tell that doing powders and melting them in take far less time than if you were using the frit, so the thicker color. One more time, really making sure to get the tip of that bubble completely covered in white, making sure the whole thing is one solid color. Now I was talking about bar stock a couple of seconds ago, and so this is a rod of solid color. You can see that it's colored completely through, and so if you take this, you can chip it down and you can get what's called frit. So this is a whole bunch of different frits put into one, and it's just big kind of chunks of glass that you can just put on the surface and melt in. And then that powder is just the frit in the bar stock crushed up until it's a complete powder. They're working on that heat right back into the glass, making sure that it's a nice malleable temperature. So the actual working range of glass is around 1,000 to 1,500 degrees. That's when it's nice and movable, but it's not quite like soupy. So you can still move it around and it's not going to fight you. And you can also put a indent into it and it's not going to just melt right back out. And even with what seems like a kind of, high temperature range, we only have around 30 seconds at max to work with our glass when it's outside of that reheating chamber, because the glass cools down very, very fast as soon as it hits the air temperature. They seem to be cooling it down a little bit. White does have the tendency to turn either like black or a silvery color if you get it too hot. So they're going to go ahead and take a gather of clear over top of all of this color, just to make sure that they have both enough glass to make Humpty Dumpty the size that Sandy wants it to be, as well as to make sure that that color is completely protected and will stay that nice bright white. The layer of clear is going to be quite thin, and you're actually not going to be able to notice that there is clear over top by the end of this. It's part of the wonderful things about the optics of glass. As soon as you put a clear coat over it, over a bubble, and expand it more, the clear just seems to disappear and you just see the color. So there's a nice big gather. He's going to do what's called a strip gather. So he's actually going to let some of that clear fall right into this bucket of water that's next to our furnace, because sometimes you don't want a full extra gather. He's gathered about 2 times already. That third gather is a lot of extra weight because he is gaining about 1/3 of the circumference of the glass again, and it just gets really heavy really fast. You can also see the size of it. The block that he was using is now a little bit too small. So he's going to go in there with those papers and be able to shape this up by hand. And Jake's ready to help turn because it does get very heavy very fast. And we are going to be depicting Humpty Dumpty as this sort of egg form person. The same way that if you look at a nursery book, they depict him as. But also you needn't worry about this Humpty Dumpty being too fragile, because as we're working in sculpture, we're actually making things nice and thick. We're making them nice and structurally sound. So this Humpty Dumpty isn't going to be quite as fragile as the one who sat on that wall. So you see them standing and talking to each other. They're actually talking about the process that they're going through, exactly what steps are going to be taken and at what time. So it's really important in the hot shop to communicate as a team, to know exactly where the other person's going to be, what the other person needs to do in order to get this piece to completion. Because not only is it frustrating for a gaffer if their assistant doesn't know what they're doing, it's also very frustrating for the assistant if they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. So clear communication is very important. And you can see that at play right here. Even as Jake is turning the pipe, I don't know if you guys could hear, he said back as he's going to go and turn backwards, allowing Sandy time to move the jacks and make a nice clean jack line, which is what he's doing right now. So a jack line is very important to the process of glass blowing. If you don't have a jack line in your piece, it's impossible to take it off of the either the punny or the blowpipe or whatever it's attached to. So that tiny little constriction line really is a star point at the beginning of the glass blowing process. You can also see, so Jake is not heating the jack line right now. That is not inside of the reheating chamber until he thrusts it in, just to give what's called a flash to that moil or the glass that's still on the head of the blowpipe. The reason that he flashes that moil is so that it's structurally sound, because if the moil gets too cold, the piece could fall off. But what he was doing before was just spot heating that front end. He wants to make sure that Sandy can blow out this nice egg shape. He wants to make sure that thick part of glass at the end, remember they made it a Q-tip shape, so there's thick glass right at the top of that bubble. So he wants to make sure that's hot enough they can blow through it and make it a nice even height. And with that hot torch, I heard Sandy say that he wants to thin out that top part right there. So to get that nice and hot, and the reason that he's doing this at the bench and not in the reheating chamber is that glass has a heat memory. So as soon as it goes back into the reheating chamber, it's actually going to soak in more heat, and it's going to remember that it had a hot torch right at that spot. So it'll get nice and hot right there. And with this drill, it looks like they're going to add a tiny hole into Humpty Dumpty, because eventually they plan to crack him off this pipe and then also put something underneath of him. So you have to have a tiny hole for air to escape. It just helps in the annealing process, just to relieve any stress that could be on the inside. It's kind of like ceramics. You don't want to risk having an air bubble inside of your piece. So once again, getting that nice and hot. And it's going to blow that area out. So the bubble really wants to go to the path of least resistance. So because that glass is hotter, it's more liquidy. So the bubble can travel much easier down towards that tip, rather than it can those thicker, more solid sides. So proper heat is really all about thinking about where you want your bubble to go. So using a torch, he's going to heat up this tungsten rod so that he can actually drill that little hole in. It's not an actual drill bit, it's just kind of a stick that we're heating up and letting just go straight through. But the reason he's using a torch is so that he can actually go through the glass. If it was too cold, he would just chill that spot in the glass, wouldn't allow it to penetrate the surface. But also now, since we have that hole in there, the blowing portion is done. If he were to blow into this pipe right now, he would just kind of blow straight through this hole in the bottom, and it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to inflate anymore. But other parts of this process can be blown. Unless Jake is making what I think that he's making. He might be making a blow punny. So that means that he's actually going to punny this with a blowpipe. Normally you would punny this with a solid rod. So right now he's making sure that that's hollow, and also making sure there's enough glass to kind of stick to the end of this egg form. So a punty is going to be a temporary kind of holder of the piece. It's kind of like a glue joint that's meant to be broken off later. You just can't do everything on one pipe. It is important to transfer them off to separate pipes as you're working. And the punty is also very important to get exactly right. If your punny is too hot or too cold and you break off the other piece, you could end up with your entire piece completely on the floor. So it usually takes a couple of minutes to make one of these more complicated punnies to make sure that they're absolutely perfect and will work for what they need to be used for. So now it looks like they're ready for that transfer. So that blow punny is going to go directly on, be centered with the hole that Jake has drilled. It's going to get squished right on. They're going to wiggle it back and forth to make sure that it's completely sealed, because if you're going to blow through it, you can't have a hole in the end. He's also going to add a little bit of a jack line so you can eventually break the break the entire punny completely off the piece, and it can be ground away later. So he's chilling that jack line, getting it nice and cool, getting it stressed out with a little bit of vibration. It's going to break clean free, and then we're going to go right into that reheating chamber to equalize the temperature of both the punty and the piece. You can also see he's going in for deep flashes, pulling out and heating just the face, just because that is now the coldest part. He had to chill it. He had to chill that now opening just so he could get it off of the blowpipe. And they're going to work on drawing a face onto Humpty Dumpty. They're going to use a little black stringer. So this is glass that was already, it was colored and then stretched into a thin rod so that Sandy can use it kind of like a crayon to just draw on the glass. So he's going to heat that up, get it nice and malleable and be able to just stretch the glass along the surface in a very controlled way. So we're slowly building heat up in that piece. You don't want it to be too cold because then it can just stick to the face and then you have a big black stringer sticking out of this egg, which I don't believe Humpty Dumpty has ever been depicted as having.
That's what happens when you try to be cool.
And so sometimes things slip out of our hands. We've all been very excited about giving these demonstrations, and we've been thinking about them for forever, and sometimes we put a little bit of pressure on ourselves. But glass breaks, it happens, we pick up, we keep going. So you're going to start, you see, and it is important that Jake keeps flashing this piece or taking quick little bursts into that reheating chamber and bringing it back, because if he waited for the entire time that it takes to draw this on, the punty that was just made could crack and the whole piece could fall to the floor. So once again, it's really important to think about how hot your piece is, how long it can be out in the air. It doesn't matter what step you're on, steps can be broken up into multiple heats, but you can't just leave your glass out for forever. It gets too stressed out and it'll break. So now he's got some little eyebrows right above his eyes. He has a big old smile. It's a very happy egg. So they're checking everything out, making sure that Sandy is happy with his piece right now. Just thinking about the next steps and what's going to happen next. And Jake is going over to the garage. So we did make pieces, So we made pieces earlier for this piece, and we've actually hosted them right now in our garage, which is this piece of equipment right here. So what Jake has in his hand is the top hat for the egg, and he's heating it up back into a nice workable temperature so that it doesn't get stressed out when it goes into the reheating chamber. And so all of those parts will get reheated and then stuck onto Humpty Dumpty. So inside of that garage is the hat, his arms, and his legs. And as we were talking about the garage, looks like Sandy is making sure that that punty has a nice jack line in it so that when he's ready to break off Humpty Dumpty, he can come out all in one piece. None of the king's horses and none of the king's men will have to put him back together again.
Pretty close. Whenever you're ready.
And so using that fluffy torch, he's just making sure that this entire, the punny's nice and warm, as well as the entire egg. Just making sure it's a nice, happy temperature. He especially wants to make sure that that punty doesn't get too cold. So they're talking back and forth, asking how they're going to attach this hat, which you can see here. So it's a little top hat. Humpty Dumpty's a little bit more dapper than I remember him from childhood, but he still looks really nice. And as I said at the very beginning of this, hot glass only likes to stick to hot things. So they're going to make sure that both the hat and Humpty Dumpty's head are very, very hot so that this hat can stick nicely onto the top of his head. It's kind of like a Goldilocks situation too, if you're thinking about it. Everything has to be just right for these things to stick together. So here's that connection. And once again, that wiggle, wiggle back and forth to make sure that everything is sealed. And he gave it a little bit of a cold shock with that cold tool. He's going to give it a tap here in a second. And Humpty Dumpty has a hat now. Now the only thing left is to assemble his appendages, which once again they're going to have to heat both areas and then stick it on. And he's making sure that hat's nice so you can still see his eyebrows underneath of it. And so as we're waiting on the legs to come over, he's going to go ahead and just make sure that punny's hot, but make sure everything else is relatively cool. He doesn't want his piece to be moving around that much as he attaches other things. He wants to be able to just spot heat right where he's going to add those legs. So if he just gets the whole thing hot, then there's a good chance that the wall around that bubble that's inside of all this white is just going to get pushed in, and it's not going to look quite right.
Okay, I'm going to start preheating that section.
And so, this door? And so here come the legs. And Humpty Dumpty's going to start getting spot heated for that leg to be attached to him. The legs themselves are on just a plate, and they're getting put into the reheating chamber just to get nice and evenly warmed up.
We'll come back to that in a second. I'm going to use my cutting instead.
So sometimes our tools just don't have enough grip. And so we're going to have to try that again. Leg on. He's a very fancy man with a little boot on. And because he's all white, he looks like he has a clear little sack. He's going to make sure, because that was just knocked off into the garage, just tapped off. So there was a little bit of a sharp point where it was attached to the pipe beforehand. So he hit it with the hot torch again, just to smooth out any sharpness, to give him more of a knee. Because it looks like the way that he's being constructed right now, Humpty Dumpty will indeed be able to sit onto a wall or a bookshelf with his legs hanging over, which might help you imagine him in your own home. I do want to say that everything we're making at the Great Artiscape, both this weekend and last weekend, everything is for sale. And that does benefit our scholarship fund, so people can actually come and learn how to blow glass here at the Toledo Museum of Art. And Jake's just come over with leg number 2, so I'm gonna get it nice and warm. And Sandy's going to spot heat right where that second knee is going to go.
Right here.
And once again with those gripping diamond shears. He's going to finagle where it's going to go.
Take it back. Sorry.
Get a little bit too cold there. I'm going to go ahead and make everything nice and warm again. Sometimes it's really hard because you have to do pretty much everything with your right hand. So positioning things onto a body and making them symmetrical is sometimes very awkward to do. And so you saw right there for a minute, Humpty's hat got a little flip in the brim, and that is because the hat is currently the thinnest part of his entire body. The brim of his hat is probably only 1/4 of an inch thick, and the rest of him is probably like 1/2 an inch to a little bit bigger thick. And just because it's so thin means that it will get hotter a lot faster, especially because that entire hat is made with a black color, and black absorbs the heat a lot faster than the white will. But there we are. He has 2 legs now. He's ready to sit prim and proper. But to give him a chance of survival, Sandy's going to give him some arms so he can catch himself. Sandy's going to let everything get nice and hot right now. You can see that bright glow of the hat. As I said before, all of the spots that are black are going to heat up a lot faster than this white does. So the white is going to kind of bounce all that heat back off of it for a second before slowly absorbing it. And that black is just going to instantaneously soak it all in. It's like if you have a white car or a black car in the summer. It's the same thing. The white car's not going to get nearly as hot as the black one does. Which is why it's always really impressive when you look at glass blowing and you see somebody who makes vessels that are black and white together because they're totally different and they expand differently as well. So if you're ever looking at something that's black and white stripes, know that that person had a lot of skill. With that fluffy torch, you're giving it an all-over heat, but excluding that hat, because the hat's a little toasty right now. You're just gonna let that cool down, and then the glass is gonna remember that the body, the feet, the punny, and the body of the egg are supposed to be a little bit warmer than that hat itself. And again, if you're looking at the egg, as soon as it's coming out of that reheating chamber, you are seeing all that glow and all that heat in the black. But as I said at the beginning, the white doesn't really show heat in the same way. So that white is still just bright white. So it's really hard to tell how hot white is.
How's it looking? It's ready. Alright, we can come over.
And now we're gonna get ready with this first arm and little glove.
We get a door over here, please.
And as we're working here, as been a common theme in all of our demonstrations today, we are opening up both sides of this reheating chamber, opening the first set of doors, just to expand the circumference of our opening. Because we are really just limited by the size of our reheating chamber, both the circumference of the opening and the length of the actual unit itself. Thankfully, I don't think that Humpty Dumpty has a problem with fitting all the way inside of that reheating chamber, especially with that first arm right now. Gonna get the rest of it really nice and hot, and then in a second, this other arm will be added. Gonna go back, make his top hat nice and straight. Make him look very dapper.
Alright, I'm going to start reheating this last one. Yeah, no problem.
You can also tell during this entire demonstration, Jake and Sandy have been communicating really well, especially with all these added pre-made parts coming together, because they're going to have to heat them up to a nice temperature and then bring them over, heat them up even more, and everything needs to be just at the right time, just in the right order. So So now we're going to heat up that last hand in that reheating chamber right there.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Now, I don't know if you guys can see, but when Jake pulls out that tray, you can see that glowing red of the metal. And that's just how hot it gets just from being inside of that reheating chamber for a couple of seconds. It gets to glow red hot. And so there's Humpty Dumpty, has 2 hands now. And here we are with a third door open. Just a little extra wiggle room here. And if you guys are worried about the heat against Sandy as he's flashing his piece, he does have a heat shield, that big black kind of rectangular thing next to the reheating chamber. Soaks up a lot of the heat as he ducks kind of behind it. And it is a very natural way to sand, just to duck underneath that heat shield. And right after we got this last hand in place, we actually have Jake suiting up to put Humpty Dumpty away in the annealer. He's putting on his heat protective equipment, including the Kevlar gloves. So you can't really touch this Humpty Dumpty right now. It's still going to be very hot. Even when it goes into the annealer, it'll be around 900 degrees. And so we have Kevlar gloves that are fire resistant, that can be used for brief moments to pick up the glass and put it away. And right now, Sandy's going to start flashing this down. He's going to let everything get to a nice, even heat that's fairly low. He doesn't want it to be moving around at all. The only thing he really wants to be moving is that punty, so that he can break it off a little bit easier. And did another couple of flashes, he'll be ready to go, ready to put this away. Yeah. So flashing this down does take a little bit of time. You want to make absolutely sure that this piece you just spent an hour making is perfect and ready to come off. Especially with those little leg overhangs, you want to make absolutely sure they're happy. So they're talking about where they're going to break this piece off. We do have a knockoff table that we normally use, but I think they're talking about knocking this off just right at the bench so that Jake can just carry it across the hot shop and put it safely in the annealer. Very careful not to drip water on any of those appendages. He's adding that thermal shock, cooling that punty, and tapping it right on off. He's hopping them back and forth. But into the annealer Humpty Dumpty goes. And he's all in one piece right now, so that's great.
Thank you.
Great job. But so I'm going to talk to you briefly about the actual process of annealing. So in this oven that you just saw Humpty Dumpty go into, he's going to set at around 900 degrees right now. And as he sits at 900 degrees, he is completely a solid form. He's solid glass. But once we hit a button over here on our control panel, we're going to send him down to slowly cool overnight. So he's going to go from 900 degrees all the way to room temperature very, very slowly. If Humpty Dumpty were to cool down too fast, he would crack. He could explode, he could crumble, but he would not be a solid piece anymore. So we're going to make sure that all of the stress in him is completely alleviated and he's ready to go tomorrow. There's a piece in our ancient collection. It's actually in the middle. It's not quite as ancient as the other pieces, but it's a large sand-casted bench. And it's around 3 feet thick. And annealing that took a lot longer than Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty's probably only around ½ an inch thick at his absolute thickest. And because that bench is 3 feet thick, it took around 11 months to cool down. So when you're working on annealing a project, you want to make absolutely sure that you take into account the thickness of your glass. Alrighty, that's all we have for this demo, and thank you so much for tuning in to the Great Artistscape. We look forward to seeing you inside of our museum, inside of our galleries very soon. Thank you so much. Have a great night.